Hello, welcome to InfoFire, the fireside chat series from Information Matters. InfoFire is where visionaries and experts from diverse domains come to share their stories and perspectives on a chosen topic. Each episode features a conversation between our guest and your host. I am Shalini R, your host for this series. With over 4 decades of experience in teaching and researching information, I bring you these engaging discussions. I have founded two educational institutions, the International School of Information Management at the University of Mysore, with support and seed grant from the Ford Foundation in the year 2005, and the Myra School of Business in 2012, which focuses on the triple bottom line. In today's episode, I am honored to be in conversation with Dr. Jean-Claude Guédon, a leading advocate of the open access movement and Professor Emeritus of Comparative Literature at the University of Montreal, Canada. Our discussion today centers around the topic Whither open access. Allow me to introduce Dr. Jean-Claude Guédon. Born in France, Dr. Guédon came to the US in the early 1960s as an American Field Service exchange student. He earned his bachelor's degree in chemistry and later, in 1974, a Ph.D. in the history of science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dr. Guédon began his academic career at York University in Toronto, Ontario, before moving to the University of Montreal. He first joined the Institute of History and Sociopolitics of Science and then later served in the Department of Comparative Literature until his retirement. His career has spanned continents as he served as a visiting professor at several esteemed universities, including Johns Hopkins University in 1975, University Louis Pasteur, Strasbourg in 1983, École des Chartes, Paris 2001, University Lyon 2003, University of Sao Paulo 2008, University of Amsterdam 2010, and Politecnico of Turin 2011. Dr. Guédon has been recognized with numerous awards and distinctions, including being one of the three laureates of the Charles Hilo International Prize for a Francophone in 1996. He has contributed extensively to the open access movement, playing a pivotal role in the landmark events such as the Budapest Open Access Initiative 2001 and 2 and its declaration. His involvement with various boards, including the Information Subboard of the Open Society Foundations and the Canadian Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences, has been instrumental in advancing open access and scholarly communication. He was a member of the advisory board of IFIL, Electronic Information for Libraries, during 2003 and 7. Since 2011, he has been a trustee of the Nexa Center, Internet and Society of the Politecnico in Turin. Between 2017 and 19, he was chair and ultimately rapporteur of the expert group on the future of scholarly communication and publishing systems for the European Commission. He joined the board of the Whither Foundation as member at large in December 2023. Dr. Guédon has authored 3 books and around 150 scholarly publications. Notably, he founded Surfaces, Canada's first electronic scholarly journal, which was published from 1991 until 2000 and is still accessible on the Erudite platform. Most recently, he was awarded a doctorate honoris causa from the Universidad Nacional de Quito, Argentina in 2021. Now, let us dive into our conversation with Professor Jean-Claude Guédon, who's here to share his views, stories, and perspectives. Hi, Jean-Claude. Welcome to InfoFire, the Fireside Chat series from Information Matters. It's an absolute honor and, of course, a pure joy to have this conversation with you on the topic of Whither open access.
Well, thank you very much. And the honor is for me. Thank you for the privilege and the great pleasure of seeing you again after so many years.
Likewise. Thank you once again and welcome. Open access has been dear to our hearts since probably, it's in this context that we met first time, sometime probably in 2000 in the US at the NDLTD meeting, if my memory serves me right. So, my first question to you is premised on this assumption, or if you will, fact, that the knowledge life cycle has two key players: the creator of knowledge and the consumer of knowledge. Even though these two players' roles overlap, their objectives and motivations differ. So, my question is that while open access has achieved, I would say, tremendous success, or at least significant success, with estimates of between 30 to 50% of the scholarly literature available in open access. My question to you is, the open access has been primarily, in my view at least, focused more on removing barriers to access, thereby the consumer side of the life cycle. So, do you think, or according to what is the overarching mission of open access?
Well, let me first making a small vocabulary comment. Yeah, there are creators of knowledge, and I would put in foreground the notion of knowledge very, very strongly. Knowledge is very special, and it's very, very important for humanity. So you have creators of knowledge. I don't think you have consumers of knowledge, and I think you have users of knowledge
Yes.
and people who are trying to grapple with knowledge. And I'm saying this because what has been going on actually in the whole open access saga, let's call it that way, has been a mixture of issues, some of which that have been dominated by not open access, but by what is the right business plan for open access. And that's a side issue. It's a secondary issue, but somehow it has become very, very much very important. And it has, I think, created a lot of problems for the whole open access sort of thing. The second thing is that, yes, open access is to remove barriers, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, later on today, but it's not good when you remove barriers in one end just to create barriers at the other end. In other words, if you start saying to people you can read anything you want, but if you want to be part of the conversation, you have to pay, you're obviously creating something very strange and bizarre. And again, this has been one of the issues of open access. I would also say that one of the problems with open access is that a very essential element has not been discussed enough. Marshall McLuhan, the communication specialist from Canada, used to say, "Don't look at the future in your rearview mirror." And in a sense, open access has done just that. We've been looking at the future, trying to see how to do more of what we used to do in a better way. But we are in a different circumstances right now. The digital revolution is going on, and it's not a minor factor. It's a very fundamental element. And we've got to start thinking about how does open access fit within something much broader and bigger, which is the whole digital revolution, the whole context, the whole infrastructural value of this context, which in fact is creating a new kind of world for knowledge creation, knowledge sharing, knowledge receiving, and knowledge evolution. So we're really in a different world, which open access has not yet grappled well with. And I think that's my first great concern about open access now in 2024.
24.
So it's like I mean, McLuhan is one of my favorite authors too. Anyway, you have, of course, we have already acknowledged that everyone acknowledges that you have been a prominent figure in the OA landscape. I would call you as the sage on stage kind of a figure on open access. So I would like you to look at the rear view mirror, not for the future, but to look back and reflect and then see what you would have done differently or you would not have done. Especially, you wrote this book, a wonderful book, Long Shadow of Oldenburg, in I think 2000 or some 25 years back, right? So do you still see that long shadow, or do you want that long shadow to continue? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the that's one of the things. I'm going to use the example of the bicycle,
Okay.
which was invented at the end of the 19th century. And there is a wonderful series of studies by a Dutch scholar named Berke
Mhm.
about this. And what he shows is that while there was companies trying to see how to create some sort of transport system for individuals,
Mhm.
which would be something like a bicycle, but not knowing how to do it, of course, and they didn't know the future of their time. At the same time, there were audiences that were dealing with the bicycle, and they were shaping by their reactions what the bicycle was ultimately going to be. And in this case, you had the family wanting to travel together. There are the people who wanted to race, the people who wanted to go to work cheaply, and so on and so forth. And every time these people had different requirements for the bicycle, and you had to somehow do that. Well, scientific publishing also depends on technical objects like that, which are really placed inside a certain kind of environment. And what we did is that we started with a legacy. And that's where I'm going back to this great change with the digital environment. We had a legacy which was made up largely of journals and articles and a little bit books, but mainly journals and articles. And what we've tried to do is what the companies did when they were trying to invent the bicycle. They just tried to take the journal lock, stock, and barrel and plop it inside the digital environment. It doesn't work that way. We have to rethink what kind of vehicle we want to have to communicate with each other, to discuss with each other, to come along with the you might say the right kind of instruments to foster, enhance, accelerate the great conversation that I've been talking about ever since probably the Oldenburg long shadow. And in effect, the long shadow has been a big hindrance in the open access thing because we've tried to fit open access within a series of technical objects, the journals, which maybe are not entirely appropriate for what is coming in the next few decades or the next century. So we're really in a transition period in which we are very much, I would say, unbalanced in some ways. That's how I would characterize that. Now, if I look back very specifically at certain events between, say, the late 90s and now, especially when I was working with the Open Society Institute, then now foundations, I remember one event in which I really made a mistake, really a mistake. I visited with Melissa Hageman, who worked at the time for the foundations. We visited the rising offices of PLOS, the Public Library of Science,
Mhm.
and they were discussing their business model. Again, you see the consumer issue I was raising earlier. They were talking not about open access, but the right kind of business model for open access. And of course, they were using already the APC model, that is the article processing charge thing. I just couldn't wrap my mind around all the consequences and all the things of that article processing charge, but I refrained from saying no. And I should have said no. I should no. Let's not go there. And
Oh.
and the foundation supported PLOS. I was on the board at the time. I could have had a very strong voice to say, no, don't support that sort of business plan. But I saw I just couldn't see all the ramifications of it. So I decided to remain gently quiet for once, and I didn't say no. And now, and of course, when Plus came into the field with that business plan, it legitimized what Biomed Central had done with VTech Traction and Jan Velterop, because they are the ones who invented the article processing charge. And then it moved on to Springer, with Velterop moving to Springer. And at that point, the article processing charge began to gain the kind of importance it has gained now in the open access field, creating what I would call the greatest perversion of open access one can imagine. So that would be the point when I would say, no, I should have said no. I should have stood up. I should have said, no, we are moving in a different direction.
Okay. Thank you for that insight. And then, I know it's always easy to hindsight say this, but, it's important for us to acknowledge that we could have done probably differently.
That's
So
right.
you are really a sage to do that, acknowledge that you could have done differently, maybe, the change the direction of the OA movement. Before I go segue into the my next question about this, APC or even the models, etc., I have one question based on your response about, I mean, it's true that always, humanity or civilization kind of extends the old model, whether it is the cycle or the aeroplane or whatever, because I read somewhere the initial design of the aeroplanes were something like trains, right? The kind of seating, etc. So the question here is not about the trains or the extrapolation of the earlier model, but when we talk about Oldenburg or when we talk about journal, I would say the three main objectives of journals, such as, like the first one being the intellectual credit and all of that to the authors, and the second one being the archiving function, the third one being the dissemination or communication function. That, do you think that still remains the same, or that should have also changed in the new?
Oh, it has changed, yes. Many studies have now documented the fact that behind the name journal, and that's another aspect we have to be careful about, we maintain continuously certain words, but they change actually meaning, sometimes very subtly, sometimes very softly, and suddenly you're with a different object. The journals that were created in the 17th, early 18th century were vastly different from our journals. For example, most of them were either academic journals or small commercial journals, but the commercial journals had a mixture of goals, which have now been quietly and rather, I would say, well defined between what you might call popularization of science, the news about science, and the news of science to scientists, which are two different things. But this sort of came along. Another dimension too that happened in the 19th century is that many journals were being created in the 19th century by people that wanted to defend a position that was not necessarily the dominant one. So you had groups of scientists suddenly creating a journal to appear with their own thesis inside the journal. There was not this notion that you fit into normal science, so to speak, until a revolution in science comes along, if you want to use Kuhnian vocabulary. No, you created new journals, and you try to defend your position. Some of these journals, of course, went down in flame, like phrenology journals, but you had journals about Darwinian evolution or forms of or many areas, even in physics, when people started debating the nature of light as being a wave rather than being a particle with the work of Fourier and Young in the early 19th century, you had the necessity to bring about new organs to speak. So your journals change with time, although they're still called journals. The big change, really big, took place after the Second World War. And that's when the commercial world took over the journals and displaced the learned societies. Instead of having societies exchanging their journals with other societies so as to have a better reach and a better impact through that exchange, companies came in and started moving into the field, creating a market for journals. And that meant that the journal became also a merchandise. That's very, very, very important. It became a merchandise, and then two logical objectives began to interfere with each other: market shares and reputation. And you had to sort of reconcile the two, which was the great problem of the commercial publishers around 1970, 1980, and they did that with the impact factor. Thanks to the impact factor, they made the two when you had a high impact factor, you had a bigger chance of getting a bigger market. Also had a the reputational value added to the journal. Then you extended the reputation of the journal to the authors. If you write in a journal with high reputation, you're obviously a high reputation author, which is a bit funny. It's not because you move into a big house that you're a big person. And then we have the situation that develops just before the internet revolution and the digitization really began to move forward. So you see how the journal has changed completely. It used to be a vehicle of communication, of discussion, of debates. It became a merchandise. It became a merchandise. And then you have to think about the fact that when companies are involved with a merchandise, they want to control their market. They have consumers. Now we go really into consumers, and you have consumers, and you try to maintain your brand as high as possible while excluding as many people as possible. For example, the Web of Science, with its limited number of journals, is more a tool to exclude journals, to really monitor journals. You just say these are the good journals, the rest don't pay attention to them, and lo and behold, all these good journals are all the ones that are owned by big companies like Elsevier, like Springer, Wiley, and Taylor and Francis, and so on. It's really a very bad scene that developed in that 30 years between 70 and 90.
Yeah, so perpetuating the rich getting richer phenomena.
Oh yeah. Well, what do you the Matthew principle is very simple to explain when you approach it from that angle, because it's really a market share strategy, and you create what my colleague Vincent Larivière has well defined as an oligopoly, which is controlling a large part of the market of journals. But confusing science with the market of journals is really an abominable thing in my mind.
Yeah. So in the last 30 years or so, and of course, this is one of the major thing, as you mentioned, commercial publishers coming into the general publication, but going back to the open access movement, it has seen several models: green, gold, bronze, hybrid, and diamond also, right? So currently, what is, of course, there is this open science movement, which is supported by UNESCO and others. So what are your thoughts, and do you think that what would be the trajectory of OA in the future in the context of open science?
Well, in terms of objectives, the future, I don't believe in technological determinism. So the future, we've got to decide what we want, and then we have to to fight for it, essentially. And there are people fighting for a different future. So we have to know that too. The future, in my opinion, that we must, personally, I would say must strive for is the diamond model, which is no fee for authors, no fee for readers. Okay, now come back to that later on because some people are going to say, but where does the money come from? I have a very simple answer to that, but obviously it requires a little bit of thinking out of the box in there. And so you have to create a world in which you want diamond publishing. And open science is very important too, because it takes into account the whole cycle of production of knowledge with all the elements that go into the production of knowledge beyond and beside the simple publishing phase. In other words, the data, the what do you call this? The software that you may need to curate the data and use the data, and all the elements which essentially allow team B to really replicate what team A has done to verify that what team did
the reproducibility aspect, which is not there in the open access, right?
That's right. That's right. So open science is a very important element. Open access is a subset of that, and the publishing part of the scientific process should go with the diamond journals. And I've been extremely active with the opera's European project, precisely on this front of diamond. It is the way to go, in my opinion. You know, I'll say more about that if you want, because there is a way also of tying in the green option with the diamond in a very lovely way, which then gives a great coherence to the whole system.
So in your view, moving from green to diamond is perhaps the way forward.
Well, the two elements work together. Okay. I see. I'll come back to that. I'll bring about Lorcan Dempsey's notion of an inside-out library, and I think that you start with the green inside out, and then, but I'll elaborate that if you want at the right moment.
So my next question, of course, we all know that it is the funding agencies who have played a pivotal role, and then they have been the key drivers in the success of the OA movement. Could you elaborate more, offer your insights from an insider point of view as a funding?
Yeah, well, that's a very complicated story, but it's a fundamental one. If you look at the money side of the scientific publishing activity, let's call it that way, obviously there are two sources of money, essentially, the funding agencies and the libraries. The libraries buy the stuff or license the stuff for a fee, and the funding agencies support the research and have come to understand that publishing is part of the research process. So maybe they have to contribute there, and many of them have done it stupidly enough by paying APCs. Now, my first recommendation is that all funding agencies stop paying APCs. Just stop it. Don't do it. And then, of course, take the consequences of that, which is evaluate your people differently. Don't evaluate them by where they publish, but by the quality of what they do, which is something entirely different. But we can come back to that. So what happened essentially is, I would say, a typical human story where things start with the sort of right objective, with the right motivation, the wrong objectives, and a messed up system. The European Union, with Plan S, started with this idea of we have all these funding agencies. If we can get them together, this is maximum power, and we can really do open access. But immediately they go to the publishers and say, okay, how much can we pay for your APCs? And that is absolutely stupid. They wanted a quick and dirty, literally quick and dirty solution to the problem of open access. Now, the good thing is that they named a director for Plan S, Johan Rorik, who I think has his heart in the right place. The reason is that Johann had freed his own journal, Lingua, from Elsevier, but had to recreate Glossa in the process because Elsevier owned the title of his journal. But Johann, whom I know quite well, is a person I think who is trying to push Plan S in the right direction. Except he has to still deal with a number of people who still think that publishers are there to be recognized as such, a power that be. You have to negotiate with them, and they have the big stick in their hands. So we'd better be nice to them. I say no. I personally, I say no. When you have 10, 15, 20 funding agencies together, and if they decided together, including some of the charities like Wellcome and Gates, in Britain and the USA, um, if you have these kinds of clout, you can go to the publisher and say, "Niet, we are not going to go with the APC model anymore. The money we're giving to research is going to include maybe 2 or 3% to support the publishing and the communication of science among scientists. And we are going to evaluate our people for the grants according to criteria that no longer consider journals as an element of judgment. Okay, no longer. If they did that and did it very clearly, it would be you'd see the stock exchange value of the stock of these companies just plummet within weeks. It would plummet. So they don't do it. Why? Because they are governmental, and there is an intense lobbying activity going on in Washington and in Brussels. I've seen it at close hand, and it's a battle. It's really a battle, but it's not a battle based on the nature of open access. It's really basic, stupid, dirty even political battles where people sort of, literally affect the behavior of civil servants and of people in charge inside the public organizations. Luckily, we are seeing more and more people in those organizations saying, no, we're beginning to see the reality of the thing. This thing becomes, to use publisher vocabulary, this thing is becoming unsustainable. We have to have a system which both enhances the conversation among scientists and the durability, the resilience of the whole communication and publishing system, while maintaining its transparency, its ability to create replicability and reliability and integrity, which are increasingly lacking in the present system of publishing. So this would be, I think, my first reactions. Some funding agencies in Latin America, in particular, are beginning to join there, and I think the Cielo system of organization has been very clever in this regard, even though I think Cielo right now is not following the right path. But the basic idea behind Cielo is extremely good. It shows that when you put funding agencies into a group, a forum, and they can discuss their own problems together, then things start moving in the right direction, because these organizations want to foster research, both for the scientists and for their countries. And this is important.
So, I mean, just to conclude the same discussion, because my question is about the elephant in the room is the APC in one sense,
Yeah.
right? So we need to address that. And then to some extent, the Plan S, as well as even the Gates Foundation and others, have actually put restrictions on the APC. They said we are not going to pay for APC through our funding. Even, I mean, like Gates also has said, the Gates Foundation also has said that. So as you said, it's not a sustainable model anymore now, right? the gold model or the APC model is not a sustainable model. So what are your insights? I mean, like you did allude to that. Where is the money? And you are going to talk about it. Somewhere somebody, and then diamond, of course, is one of the solutions that you gave. Could you elaborate more on the, I mean, I
Sure.
know you don't like to use the word business model, but that's what the
No,
company,
no, no,
let us say, sustainable model.
the financing of the system
Yeah.
has to be taken into consideration. There's a lot of financing which is not business models. For example, road building. When you build roads for a country. It's not a business model that you do there. You just put tenders out to get people to build your road, but the road is infrastructure for the country. I think that the publishing system of science and knowledge in general, scholarship in general, is something at the level of an infrastructure, and it should be treated as such. So, what would be the model I would support personally in an ideal world? What would be my objective? Imagine a world in which, first of all, the production in every research institution is simply collected and preserved by the local library. In other words, anybody who has something that's publishable, that their team or their direct environment thinks is good enough to be submitted for publication, would be immediately put inside the local repository. Imagine that these repositories start forming a network, and this network they are indexing each other so that anybody coming in any one of these institutions know what's in the whole thing. A bit like in the internet, if you go into the internet, if you have an internet address, you can access any other internet address. Okay, you have the same sort of system. And that's why I call it the internet of the mind, by the way, at times, because I think it's a very nice metaphor. And imagine that once these documents are in there, you have mechanisms, tools to essentially build up a system of evaluation of these documents. Don't forget, they've been collected, they've been identified, and they're being preserved. The only thing that remains now is to certify them for the game of the scientific publication. Call it peer review if you want, but it's a way of certifying that this document is good enough to be part of the great conversation of knowledge creation in the world. Okay, so then you start looking at tools like the Notify tool that has been now funded by Arcadia, the foundation, with the CORE, the Consortium of Open Access Repositories. In other words, you have tools there which essentially make it easier for documents to find people to evaluate them and be evaluated in a way which is credible, which is reliable, and which is open and transparent. So you start having many of the functions that a journal does nowadays without even having talked about a journal yet. But now you may want to recreate the notion of a journal. You may even want to keep the name journal, but you're going to again to change the meaning of the word. A journal goes back actually to what it was many, many times in the 18th and 19th centuries. It becomes the reflection of a certain community. And a journal doesn't own its articles. A journal might be a place where you guarantee the provenance of the article. In other words, like an art gallery saying this painting has come from such and such a reliable source, the journal says we guarantee that this has been peer reviewed, has been evaluated, and so on, and has been worked together. But it may not need a journal. Some articles or pieces of work may simply navigate by themselves in the whole system if they so choose and are attracting people. And once an article is inside a journal, since the journal only guarantees provenance, if another community finds an article in another journal which is of interest to that community, they can easily transfer it into their aggregation system to foreground that article, while maintaining the fact that it came from the first journal, the provenance being preserved. So then you have a system, worldwide system of publishing in which things can circulate very freely between aggregation modes and nodes, and also with the libraries inside out in the institutions, and the preservation being taken care of, and the evaluation being taken care of, and so on. Now, if the funding agencies started doing some pilot networks of a good number of libraries to start seeing what happens when this happens, you'd have something a lot better than what the European Union has done with its platform of publishing, which has cost quite a bit of money and has produced, I think, 500 articles in about 5 years, which is nothing. You know, it's the good example, the European platform, of going in the right direction with public money supporting a publishing system, but doing it in such an inefficient way then that the commercial publishers say, you see what governments can do. They can never do things right. They can, but they have to do it in the right circumstances. That's all. So that would be my utopian vision, building, growing a network of libraries, which inside out would create an ever-growing mass of important knowledge documents, knowledge-related documents, so as to create forms of aggregation, circulation, and so on of research in a country, in a region, in the world.
I have one small, I would say, a concern in this utopian model that you described, because you said first it starts with a kind of a local institutional repository, etc., right? And then, it sort of pans out into this global thing with all the layers added, review, credentializing, and certification, etc., etc. That's a grand plan. I agree with that. Not that I don't. But my small concern is when it starts with this kind of a small, whatever, local thing. See, there is always, in my view, I have sort of experienced it coming from I would say, a state university such as the University of Mysore, when we are compared to, say, something like the so-called IITs and Indians of Science, etc. There is this, I would say, unconscious bias towards local, not so well-known institutions and their publication. So in a way, unless there is an external, don't call it journal, whatever, where, the reputation of a publication is also related to the reputation of the institution. They are, working in that manner, right? So how do you break that? My question is that.
Right. Now, this gets me back to Clarivate and the Web of Science or Scopus, exclusionary systems that have put inside a certain fence a bunch of journals which are supposed to be the good journals of knowledge in the world, which happen to be the best merchandise as well for those companies. If one of the problems with this system in passing is that if, for example, problems arise in one part of the world, which are not of interest to the economically dominant part of the world, let's say the North Atlantic waning but still strong setup, it's going to be essentially neglected. I always go back to Sambhunath Dey in India, who was doing this magnificent work on cholera, and even managed to publish it in Nature, and no one paid attention. Who cares about cholera? We don't have cholera. We haven't had cholera for a century. Well, that's not true. I mean, there is a lot of cholera in the world, but it doesn't matter. Okay. So it seems to me that there are a lot of questions which, by the present system, are simply being neglected. It even grows worse because people are being evaluated by the citations of their work. People will go inside the communities which are largest because that's where they have the greatest chances of being cited. So, for example, you find in genetics people congregating on certain genes where a number of people already work because they know that if they work there, there will be people to cite them. While if they go to a new gene no one has looked at yet very much, people are going to say, what's that? Well, I'm not interested in that gene. And no one is interested in that gene. So I'm not going to cite that paper. And this is the kind of bias that is created all the time. The bias is not purely reputational, it's also based on the impact factor and the citation counts, which is really a perversion of the production of knowledge. Now, if you have in, say, universities that say suffer, to use that term, a sort of complex of inferiority, which is may not be real. I mean, the people inside those universities are probably intellectually as good as any place else. There's no reason why they shouldn't be. And human minds are human minds, and if you take 1,000 profs in one institution versus another, you're probably going to get the normal Poisson distribution of geniuses and morons, and somewhere a majority somewhere in between. So if you look at institutions like that, there is no reason why a priori these institutions should be considering that they are less than other institutions, except if, and there again we're in the perverse game, except if you're stuck within a ranking game, with which is based on what? Oh, lo and behold, citation journals. Oh, the impact factor is again there. So those universities are being deluded into battles and competition around their impact, quote unquote, meaning citation counts in the impact factor in the Shanghai or the Times Higher Education rankings or whatever they are. Crap. This is crap. I mean, I repeat, crap. Nothing else. When they caught in that, then they start having their inferiority complex, and then they want to get into Nature and Science and Lancet and the rest of it. And so no, let's have this inside-out network building up. Let's see also what new questions, which are much more relevant for the countries or the regions, that can emerge from such an organization and show not only the intellectual value of the work, but also its social value, its economic value for the countries, and so on. I mean, cholera is important for many parts of the world, and it would be really nice to get rid of it in many ways, even though the North Atlantic doesn't care a whit about cholera, and start developing a body of the work which sooner or later, if it is widely accessible and widely discussed in parts of the world, is going to let the North Atlantic realize that they are the ones being on the margins of the important stuff, not they being at the center of the important stuff. You have to rebalance a world in which the North Atlantic represents barely 12% of the world's population, and therefore doesn't represent more than 12% of the world's intelligence. 88% of the world's intelligence is not in the North Atlantic. 88%. And I live in the North Atlantic. I know the place well. I'm from there. But we've got to get rid of these old delusions of superiority. It's the whole neo-colonial kind of mentality that we've got to get out of and really correct our sights correspondingly.
Through that. So anyway, going back to the citation, you brought in the citation impact factor, the delusion of that, etc. One of the touted benefits of open access has been the citation advantage. And even though there is no consensus regarding, or the evidence also saying that this is what is there. So,
and I say, I've had long debates with Stefan Harnad about that.
okay.
Because I used to tell Stephen, by claiming citation advantage for open access, which is more or less, maybe a little bit.
Maybe.
But
I don't know.
what you're doing is foregrounding the notion of citation as an important factor. Citations are nice and interesting as ways to follow how ideas circulate, how people congregate, what kind of oppositions develop. But as a metric, crap, crap, crap. Forget it. Forget it. It's the OA advantage in citation is actually succumbing to a logic where you're going to reiterate the importance of the impact factor. And you want to get out of that. Okay.
So OA should have reshaped the assessment and metrics of science, right? Even though there are debates about it. Do you think, according to you, OA has not been able to reshape the assessment and the metrics of science?
I agree. I agree. The open access has been very good about access. It's been very poor about how does it work on reputation. And yeah, the creators of knowledge need reputation. When we at the Open Society Institute at the very beginning after Budapest, when we were discussing about what to do, one of the first things I said, you said you've got to foreground the journals that are involved in open access because they're not as well known as many of the other journals, and you want them to be known so that reputation can be built. I was still prisoner of the journal image and the journal, the tradition of publishing, but I was on to something which I think is important, which is that open access has consistently been bad at promoting the reputation of researchers. And when it has dealt with it, unhappily, it has imitated or it has accepted the methods of creating reputation which serve the other side. So how do you want open access to succeed with this kind of strategy? If you are in a battle with two armies going with each other, and one army is doing what exactly the other side does in order to try and to resist it, it's going to become so transparent and manipulable that it's going to lose. And that's what I've been saying all along. Design reputation schemes inside research institutions, granting agencies, government promotion, and so on, which are really related to the substance of the work, not to the tools of evaluation which serve the publishing industry.
Okay. Now, moving on to another dimension, I would say, or aspect of open access publishing, retain the copyrights has been one of the mantra of open access. So again, I would like to venture say that you are continuing in the same assumptions of the old model of, copyrights or intellectual property rights, the normative principles of, the labor desert theory or the social planning theory, utilitarian theory, etc. There are now some voices being raised to make a departure or rather, include other principles, which some people have called it as a culture turn. So what are your views on how OA can, kind of be one of the fountainheads for rethinking or revisiting the entire normative theories or principles behind the intellectual property rights?
Yeah, somehow this has never been a very prominent issue for me ever since the Creative Commons solution, or at least partial solution, emerged. I think that the tools we have with the CC BY, with the NC, whatever, and so on, ND, I mean, no derivative, no commercial, whatever. I mean, people take their flavor of that as they want, and it creates minor difficulties on the edges. I have the feeling that that solves a great many of the problems that we have. And if you add, although I'm not entirely convinced either, but if you add the sort of scheme that John Wilinski had developed about copyright as a forced licensing, like the radio system for the songs, Yeah, that could be an interesting idea to explore and so on. But somehow I can't see it as a very so central an issue because if you use, CC BY, for example, CC BY does create problems for some types of publications, particularly with the APC next door and the predatory journals using CC BY to do all sorts of very nasty and very, very, very unsavory things. But if you, except for that kind of thing that has to be really monitored and controlled, I would say that the copyright issue is yeah, in an ideal world, I think the whole area of knowledge should be taken out of copyright. Absolutely. It's humanity's knowledge, it's humanity's possession, it should be in humanity's hands, and period. But the solutions we have, to my mind, maybe I'm wrong, but they appear reasonably effective and reasonably workable, and I don't put them at the top of my concerns, if you want, in my
Yeah,
worries.
I agree. This is not top of the, or at least central to the OA movement. I was just asking because retained, I mean, one of the things that, of course, it has dramatically changed the landscape or even the view of, authors of publications, because before no one even worried or bothered about this retained thing. Everyone happily, without even thinking, gave away
Right.
the copyrights, etc. So today people are cognizant of the, why should I give away my right? But in a way, totally changing, I would say, in the sense of going back to Mertonian principles, where he talks about the model, the communism, the one of the principles of
Yeah,
Mertonian is
yeah, yeah.
communism. So he also talks about knowledge is belongs to the community rather than to any one person or the theory. I know it
That's right.
needs a little bit of working out on how do you make people morally responsible for what they say, at the same time they don't own it. That's where you are
Yeah.
responsible. There is a response, you have to fix the responsibility of on what is written to somebody. It can't be on the society or the community. Of course, some of these things are taken care of. So we have touched
You
upon
know,
most of the issues. Yeah, go ahead, you wanted to say something, you had a.
yeah, if you allow me, I think there, to go back to the notion of reputation, unhappily, a confusion has emerged in the 19th and early 20th century, which is that the scientist or the scholar became an author. You know, it should be a scholar, or she should be a scholar, not an author. If I can make the difference, an author is someone who owns something like an intellectual property of some sort, and that's where copyright comes along, and that's how it developed, with literary ownership in the 18th century, and then of course it was reinforced in the 19th century. Scholars and scientists just followed along and they confuse themselves as authors. But I mean, if you're creating knowledge, which by essence is temporary, is going to be contested, is going to evolve and be transformed, is going to follow the forces of humanity at work on knowledge. Knowledge is only a relative thing. You never know absolutely things. That's the great paradox of knowledge. It's the most reliable form of whatever we have, and yet it's uncertain, it's temporary. We know that our present theories in science a
Yeah.
century or two from now will look very funny, and that's okay. That's all right. We're trying to predict little bits of reality as we do things in it, just to not to mess up things too much. But we've got to be honest and modest about that. We're not authors. We're not authors in the sense that the writer of a great novel is going to say, I produced the great novel, but this is pure fiction. Has nothing to do with reality in a direct way. It's just my own mind reacting to reality and just having a kind of funny story about it. Enjoy. No, this is not that. It's not that at all. Mm. And I think that's why the copyright issue is messed up and mixed up in this situation. Unhappily,
Yeah.
unhappily.
So just to, I mean, before we conclude, or just to conclude, I would say, many people consider 2018 as an important milestone, that is the formation of the coalition or Plan S as an important milestone. So my question is, well, we have already discussed about the impact of this, both positive and negative, right? In one sense, negative was the APC thing to begin with. Now they have changed. So my final question to you is, given all, in the context of all this, Whither open access, what the future holds? Where do you see as going forward?
It, yeah, yeah, yeah. Of course, as I've said, we have objectives, some of us at least. We don't always have the same objectives, even within the open access movement. Um, and it's going to be a very complex interaction and a series of battles and confrontations that are going to emerge. This said, I think the public sector is becoming slowly aware that you cannot leave the notion of knowledge production to market forces exclusively. How far we'll be able to free ourselves from market forces, I'm not sure. But the sort of enthralled uh, love for the neoliberal philosophy of everything is best done through market allocation of rare resources, I think is beginning to wane a little bit. And I think that open access is going to benefit greatly from that evolution. In other words, because in the 1970s to 90s, there was this great convergence, very neoliberal, between an intellectual project and a commercial project, with the new role of the commercial publishers in scientific publishing, we ended up in the mess we're in. I think we're slightly and slowly and miserably at times extricating ourselves from that situation. And open access has been a really important element in that. I wrote once that open access was a bit like a litmus test of the scientific publishing world, because it revealed a lot of the forces that were really at work within the scientific publishing. It certainly educated me a lot about what was going on in the whole thing. And I have the feeling that we are in a period now with the funding agencies getting involved, the ministries of science and research in higher education getting involved in a number of countries, not only in the North Atlantic, but also in Latin America, parts of Africa, probably as well in Southeast Asia and Southeast Asia. And I think all that is going to bring about a series of shifts. The sometimes the path to that new direction may go through strange terrains. For example, you might say the nationalistic turn in China, which leads to different attitudes to scientific publishing. But that's going to have a very interesting effect on the commercial side of scientific publishing, because they'll have to compose with a very powerful state, the government of China. So these are also the kinds of imponderables that are going to affect the way it moves. But I think we're moving out of the great catastrophe that silently took place around Garfield and around the Science Citation Index and the impact factor, which allowed the convergence of the intellectual with the commercial publishing objectives.
Okay. Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity to gain insights from you, and I'm sure our audience are going to love and then learn from these insights. And I wish you continue to shape the future of open access, future of humanity. Do good, better, I would say, and then we'll all be benefiting. I mean, end of the day, the overarching mission of everything is about the betterment of the society.
Well,
All
I promise you one thing. I'm just one man,
I know.
I'll do
Everyone, everything matters, right? You don't know what sparks. I mean, I know this is just one interview. Whether somebody sees it, how many people see it, how many get inspired, how many get, shaped by these things, we don't know, but we hope so, right? So,
Right, right. And
thank you
thank
so
you for
much.
the opportunity. Thank you very,
I
very much for the
hope to meet you somewhere in person too. We don't know where. Maybe I'll come to Canada. And anyway, I spend now half the time in US, my time, because
Okay.
my children are here. So maybe we will meet in person sometime. Are you come? Do you have
Tomorrow.
any plans of coming to India?
I don't have any plans right now. No, I have no. I still have some contacts with Arun,
Arun?
and and that's about it nowadays. No, I don't have any particular plans right now to go to India. Oh, I'm quite open to go, but
I know, I know.
but
Let's.
it's your country is a country I find absolutely fascinating and extremely important country, and increasingly important. I think in the next century, China and India will be the two big countries of the world, and it's on the North Atlantic will be a marginal part of humanity. It's ineluctable, and I think perhaps it's very healthy that it should be that way. It's time for another part of the world to take the command of how the planet goes, and I think India is a good candidate.
As the one of the saying goes, the arc of prosperity keeps shifting. So the
Yeah,
arc of prosperity hopefully shifts. I mean, in a way, shifts from one to another. I don't
that's
mean only to India or China, but somewhere, etc. So that over time, everything gets hopefully balanced, right? So
right. Absolutely, absolutely. Shalini, thank you so
thank you
much.
so much for this. Okay. Okay. Bye.
Bye bye.